do that. I could test the audio. Did I test it? Audio.
Welcome everybody to the TPS Eastern Region webinar for today, Working Towards a Culturally Relevant Classroom. I want to encourage everybody to, again, mute yourself so that we can all pay attention to Jessica Ellison. Jessica comes to us from the Minnesota Historical Society and the Inquiry in the Upper Midwest Project. They're one of our TPS Consortium member partners, and we're pleased to have Jessica on the line with us today. Jessica, you ready to go?
I am ready. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, great. Well, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here, and I want to thank the TPS Eastern Region at Waynesburg for having me today to talk about working toward a culturally relevant classroom. And please, at any time, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and Barb and Sue are going to be helping me monitor that so I can answer any questions that might come through. So today, like I said, we are going to be talking about working toward a more culturally relevant classroom. And to get started, I just want to introduce myself. My name, again, is Jessica Ellison, and I am a teacher educator at the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul. And, I included my headshot because I think it's important, who is talking, but I also included another image because this is really me. Here, this is me with my husband and our 4 kids at a 100-degree Chicago Cubs game this past summer. So while I am teacher educator, I teach teachers, I'm also a mom of 4 kids and serve on my local school board, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. Also, I wanted to share with you the primary source that you see on the screen is my current favorite primary source. It is from the Library of Congress, and as we're heading towards the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, I thought this was particularly poignant. And my favorite part of this whole primary source is that suffrage comes after disappointment. And so they're making a really interesting point about that women make at the turn of the century and suffrages after. So I'm going to be showing a lot of primary sources here with you today, and all of these sources are linked in the presentation so that when you get the Google Slides, you'll be able to find them yourself. So really quick about our grant project. So we have a project with the Library of Congress called Inquiry in the Upper Midwest, and we do a number of things, including webinars like we have a series of CRP instructional videos, one of which went out to you in your email, District In-Service PD, which we're doing this year, and Summer Institutes, and you can find more information at mnhs.org/IUM. And the goal of our project is to provide resources and instruction to support culturally relevant pedagogy using primary sources. And I want to draw your attention to one of the images here on the screen, the third one in with the pad of paper. This is an image of kindergartners primary source inquiry. And so as we're thinking about primary sources and doing inquiry, I think it's important that we note that this is something that is for all students, no matter their age or their ability. I also want to acknowledge that we have a lot of different people on the webinar today. We have educators from various settings, perhaps people at universities or museums or archives. I do teach teachers, and so just so you know that is the voice I'm going to be using today is talking as I'm talking to classroom teachers, but I do acknowledge that there's a lot of different expertise in the room. So today we're going to talk about a lot of things in an hour. We're going to talk about connecting the dots between culturally relevant pedagogy, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that is, and primary sources. And we're going to discuss 4 strategies to move toward a culturally relevant classroom. And I'm very specifically use that language move toward because it is a process. It's a continuous process. And then we are going to gather resources as well. Okay. All right. Well, let's just jump right in. So let's first talk about culturally relevant pedagogy. And here's a question that if you would, the chat, and just type some ideas about what you think culture is. Like when you hear the word culture, what comes to mind for you? It could be the first thing that comes to your mind. It could be things that you talk about in your. What is culture? Okay, so we have ideas, beliefs, habits, customs, great, values, beliefs, and traditions. Excellent. Food. Yep. Community. Oh, yeah, definitely, Lisa. Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts? Traditions, Sue, about what that word means? And there's many different definitions of this word, depending on who you ask. They're going to give you, a variety of different definitions. But the one that we have been using that we really like is ways of knowing. And that encompasses all of the things that you put in the chat. It's the ways that we know about our life and our lived experience and the community that we live in. I really like to use this iceberg model of culture too, because I think this gets at the idea that culture is not just what we can see, but also what we can't see necessarily. It's material and non-material. So top of the iceberg, we see things like food and holidays and language and music and fashion and things that are visible. But underneath the waves, I think it's, really important for us to acknowledge that culture is also things like concepts of fairness and attitude towards authority and elders and approaches to decision making, so that when we're talking about culture, we're not just talking about the things on the surface, but is that culture goes much deeper. So then, as we're talking about culturally relevant pedagogy, then what does that actually mean? There's a lot of different terms for this as well. I've heard culturally relevant teaching, I've heard culturally sustaining pedagogy, but we really focus on culturally relevant pedagogy. I want to start with what it's not. So it's not a checklist. I'm not going to give you a checklist and say if you check these things off, then you've done it. It's not a script. It's not a curriculum. What it is a lens through which you view your class, your instruction, your students, your curriculum, so that you are always thinking, am I being culturally relevant in the work that I do? And am I constantly thinking about how to adjust this for the students in my class? So, culturally relevant pedagogy is a teaching framework that was developed by Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings in 1991. You might have heard about this if you watched the introductory video. She did a study based on teachers of academically successful African American students. And she said, well, what was it that made these teachers and these students successful? And out of that came a book called The Dream Keepers, and also 3 tenets, which kind of create the foundation of culturally relevant pedagogy. And those tenets are that all students must experience academic success, develop cultural competence, and have opportunities to examine and critique the status quo. And you can find, again, on the same website, you can find a video for each of these 3 tenets in addition to the introductory video to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. What does it mean for students to challenge themselves and to choose academic success? What does it mean for them to develop their own cultural competence? And then also have a chance to look at the world and really critique it. So I think, a lot of you are educators, you're probably thinking, okay, so but what does this actually look like in class? So it's about examining your curriculum with that CRP lens. It's about empowering students to ask questions, for them to come up with the questions, to ask and to keep asking. And also about co-constructing knowledge with your students. I think we all can agree that that idea of a sage on the stage is kind of going away. And we really have to look to our students to help us construct this knowledge based on their own lived experience. So this is the video that was sent out. This is the introductory video, and we're not going to watch it because it will mess with our technology. But I just wanted to see if anybody had anything they wanted to share about their observations with the intro video. How did you see that students engaged with primary sources? Did you make any observations about how teachers described their CRP instruction? So if you have any comments, please put them in the chat about what you observed when you were watching this in action. And just note, oh, so we had Jennifer, she says, I love to see the students really dig into the source. Absolutely, absolutely. And all of these students are elementary students. So again, that idea that this for everyone. Oh, and yes, I saw students smiling. Isn't that what we want? You know, we hear so much that history is boring, social studies is boring, but this is not boring. These kids are really engaged. That's great. Thank you. Any other thoughts about what the teachers were saying about what they were doing in their classroom? Sue says, and sharing in the process together. It's collaborating, it's bringing their individual perspectives to the process. Absolutely. And the teachers do talk about that relevance, that if a student feels engaged and if it's authentic sources, and they can take agency in their learning, this, the students can really get into that process. Jennifer says the teachers were not sharing much, just asking lots of questions. Yes, yes. One of the teachers, I think she says something to the effect of, it's not just me in the driver's seat, right? And letting the students ask the questions. Absolutely. And so this is really the crux of CRP is accessing what our students know and allowing them to take the agency. Fantastic. Thank you. So let's connect some dots here between culturally relevant pedagogy and social studies and primary sources. So CRP empowers students to develop their cultural competence and then question the status quo. And what's amazing about that is that culture and critical questioning are vital to the social studies. I mean, that's really our bread and butter in the social studies world. It's we learn about humans, we learn about people, and we ask critical questions. And so I put a source up here from the Library of Congress. And as you can see, it is a map of Africa. Um, but it's a really interesting map of Africa from the turn of the century. And you can see that it's divided into countries, but those countries are shaded with the colonizers, with the European countries that had colonized those areas. And you'll notice that there's a very, very small section that is listed as free, and the rest of them are kind of parceled up between these European countries. And so this is a great opportunity to sort of question that status quo. Why was this map made? What did the people who lived in these places think? What did they call their places? And who were the people that were there continually throughout while these European countries were coming through? And you can see at the bottom too, in the lower left-hand corner, who made this map, which brings in another level of critical questioning. It's that dictionary map. So this brings home the idea that there's a lot of opportunity for students to ask these critical questions about the past. Social studies is also the way that humans navigate their world, and students really need the tools to understand this world that they're in now, and the world that they'll be in later. You know, and I hear people talking about students getting into the quote real world, but kids are in the real world right now, and they will continue to be in the real world. So how do they understand it? So this map here might not seem like the best avenue for that, but this is a map from 2012. Plant hardiness zone map, I would like to point out that there are parts of Alaska that are warmer than parts of my home state of Minnesota. I think surprise anyone. But if this map was made in 2012, when we're talking about climate and the shift in climate and climate change, what did this map look like 50 years ago? What is this map going to look like 50 years from now? Getting kids to think about those questions so that they're living in the moment, but also looking toward the future. And finally, kids really just can't wait until middle school to learn social studies. So if any of you work with elementary teachers or are elementary teachers, skills, and they need to be able to process this content. And on the other end of it, kids cannot leave school when they graduate thinking that social studies doesn't apply to them or doesn't include them. And a CRP lens can really be a great guide to help teachers and students do both of these things. And real quick, this is a map from the Library of Congress of the Library of Congress. It's one of the collection of Sanborn maps, which are incredible. Because they're very local. I mean, look up your place, your city, your county, the place next to you on the map in the Sanborn collection on the Library of Congress website. You know, a lot of them are included, small towns, big towns, and they're fabulous to see change over time. So I'm going to pause here. Anybody have any questions real quick before we continue into strategies? And you can also type them in as you think of them, and Sue and Barb can share them with me later. Okay, well, let's just keep plugging away. We'll talk about next strategies for how to make your classroom a culturally relevant place. And we're going to dig here into 4 strategies. And again, all of these primary sources and resources will be linked in this presentation. So the strategies are: get to know your students. And that was a theme throughout the video that, the teachers kept talking about knowing who our students are. So that's the thing we're going to start with first. Second, we're going to talk about examining your curriculum. What is it that you already teach, and how do we address it? We're going to talk about shifting your language. And finally, replacing or adding primary sources. So let's start here with getting to know your students. Your students change every year. Your students might change every semester or every trimester, but you have to get to know your students so your curriculum can reflect the individuals that your students are. So really get to know your students. How do they identify? How can you learn more about their needs, their successes, their struggles? How do students change over time? Because probably in a lot of cases, the student that you get in September is not the same student that leaves you in June. So how do you track that change over time? And then based on what you know about your students, how can you co-construct knowledge with your students? And we've been using identity charts as a way to really dig into this for students. Teaching Tolerance has a lot of great resources around identity charts. There's a lot of templates online. Put mine up here as an example, but there's a lot of different ways that you can do an identity chart with your students. So here's mine, and I showed this to my kids, and my oldest said, well, why are some of them red and some of them are not? And I told her that the red ones are the ones that when you encounter me on a daily basis, the ones that are really visible. You can tell that I speak American English. You can tell by looking at me that I'm Gen X, looking at my gray hairs, that I'm a white American, etc. The ones that aren't red are the ones that are under the surface, or maybe the ones that aren't immediately visible. You might not know just by looking at me that I'm the oldest child. But that's a huge part of my identity. You might not know that I struggle with anxiety and depression, part of my identity. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can sort of dig in to what our students feel about themselves and then what they want to share with us. So what I'm going to have you do just real quick to kind of model doing this for you and for your students is I'd like you to take out a piece of scratch paper if you've got one next to you. And again, this one is from Teaching Tolerance, but there's a lot of templates you can use, and just write your name and then think about 5 aspects of your identity. And it can be anything. And write down 5 aspects of your identity that are important to you. Okay, and this is one that you can do with your students at the beginning of the year, and then again at the end of the year to really get to know them. Okay, but think about what you would share and why. So we don't have a whole lot of time to really dig into this, but I wanted you to put this down on paper so that you were starting to think about what are the things that you would pull out of your own identity, and then think about how our students would pull things out of their identity. So when you debrief this with your students, and I'm not going to have anybody share because I think that this works best when you're in a space that's in person and it's in a trusting space where you can debrief these things. But talk about, what did you choose to include? So for some people, they might be really open to sharing things like anxiety or depression, but other people might not. Did you leave anything out, and why? Did you leave something out because you were nervous you might have to share, or that it wasn't a really important part of that identity at the time? And then how does it feel when someone ignores identity characteristics central to who you are? Something that you find is really, really important, but somebody ignores that. and talk with your students about that, you know, about how they feel and how they think others might feel when a part of their central identity is not included, because that will lead into how we look at our classroom and our curriculum, and are we ignoring parts of kids' identity that will help them feel more connected to the curriculum. Okay. Okay, so the great thing about identity charts is that they support CRP in a lot of different ways. So they will help you study your students' identity characteristics. You know, you can make this private activity, you could make this a group activity, whatever works for the kids, because you know your kids best. They will help you recognize students as multicultural, dynamic individuals, that we know that people are complicated, and that people have always been complicated, you know, as we look at history. It will help you strategize ways to use their cultural competence in your lessons. If you've got students who come from a particular place, maybe they're immigrants, or maybe students that have similar experiences, you can use that knowledge in your classroom. And then you can draw connections between students' identities and the curriculum. So you can find ways to look at your curriculum and say, here's how I can connect it for my students. Number 2, examine your curriculum. I know that teachers are overwhelmed with a lot of different things. There's a lot going on in a classroom. I mean, you've got not just the students, but you have, you know, parent relationships to foster and administration to work with, and a lot of different things. So I don't, you know, necessarily want to throw too much on your plate. What I want to do is have you look at what you're already doing and kind of pull it apart a little bit and see where you can adjust it. What meaningful questions do I ask students to address? Are my students' diverse experiences reflected in my curriculum? And are my resources relevant to my students? So this image that I put on the screen here is local to Minnesota. This takes place in a city called Walnut Grove. I don't know if anyone is familiar with what famous author came from Walnut Grove, or it was actually one of the places that she lived. But it's in the southern part of Minnesota. And that is, yep, Laura Ingalls Wilder. Thanks, Carol. So that is a mural in Walnut Grove showing Laura Ingalls Wilder next to a Hmong woman, because the current population of Walnut Grove has a lot of Hmong people, so from Laos and Southeast Asia. And so this mural was painted to show that connection over time, and how this community has many different layers and many different personalities. And so how can your curriculum reflect that for your students? So I was talking with a fourth grade teacher about just this thing, and she said, you know, I start all of my units with an essential question, and I'd like to use primary sources to engage my students in these essential questions. And so this was the very first essential question of her year, which I think is fabulous for a fourth grade teacher to be starting with this question. How can government influence the way we live? And so we talked about ways that we could connect students to this for primary sources. And so a common experience for a lot of our kids is that they have been in cars. They have been in a car at some point in time. And so this is an image from the Library of Congress. And if you have kids kind of look at this picture and talk about it and observe it, think about it, ask questions, what is missing here? And if they look really close, they can see this lady is not wearing a seatbelt. And in fact, a seatbelt does not even exist in this picture. And because of accidents and injuries and deaths, the government created laws that required seatbelts in cars. And we don't even think about it today. It's just part of our car. So flash forward to today, and what is relevant for students, the issue of cell phone use in cars. And a lot of states, including Minnesota, just passed it this year, have hands-free laws where you are not allowed to pick up your cell phone in your car. And so talking about the ways that government influences the way we live, some things came a long time ago, but we take for granted, but it's similar to what is still happening today. Another angle you could take when you're looking at how does government influence the way we live is child labor at the turn of the century. This is a 6-year-old pulling beets and an 11-year-old picking cotton, and the looks on their are so powerful and so miserable. And you can talk about the way that government came in to limit child labor so that students can go to school, which our students are still benefiting from today. So if you've got some older students and you're talking about the immigration debate, which is always going to be relevant in American history and in American studies, a really great essential question that you could focus on is, has immigration been key to America's success? And you can talk about this in a number of different ways, but bringing in diverse experiences from the past and from your own community about immigration will give kids a much more diverse picture. So, for example, Chinese workers on the railroads, young Portuguese and Italian workers in East Coast factories, Mexican farmers on beet farms in the Midwest. There's a lot of different intersections that you can make to talk about immigration throughout time and then bring it up to today. And then another way that you can make things relevant is you can connect to, again, current events in ways that students will immediately recognize, but then comparing across time. This is one of my favorite things to do. So these two quotes are from two pretty famous immigrants. And I'm not going to read them. I'm, going to let you kind of read through those yourselves, but bring in quotes and personal experiences and have students think about, oh, who might this be? I mean, do we have any ideas of who the first one is, who the second one is, what their commonalities are as immigrants to this country? And then, of course, the fun part is bringing in who they actually are. And we have here Alexander Hamilton and Ilhan Omar, who is the representative from the 5th District in Minnesota, both of whom were immigrants and both of whom are very much in the news. Hamilton, being the star of a pretty famous Broadway musical, and then Ilhan Omar currently serving in Congress. So how can we make it diverse and relevant? Number third strategy. Shift your language. And I'm going to fully admit here that this is something that I struggle with because our language is so much a part of who we are, and the colloquialisms that we grow up with and the ways that we use words. For example, I've been trying very hard recently to stop saying you guys. To be a little bit more relevant in, to whoever's in the room. But it's a way for us to kind of take a step back and say, is my language inclusive of race, gender, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status? Who are the students in my room that might be impacted by the way that I say something? Does my language assume things about my students? And I think importantly too, who can I learn from? How can I learn about the words that are the preference of certain communities, or the words that are offensive that might not have been once, or have gone the other way? For example, the word queer is a word that's being embraced by a lot of the LGBTQ community, but was a slur for quite a long time. They're reclaiming it. So how do we find these things out? And I love this poster. This is in the Library of Congress. It's also on Google Arts and Culture. And it's from the 1970s, so kind of the feminist movement happening there. And it's really powerful because it shows all these women and then just says, don't call me girl. And, I can tell you that as a 40-year-old woman, I still get called a girl. And I'm sure that, other people have had similar experiences. But what this poster is saying is, I get to choose what I am called. And so being more sensitive of the way that we use language can help our students to feel empowered and to feel like they have a place in our classrooms. So here's an example that this is, again, a personal example of mine. 8 years ago, Minnesota was revising our state social studies standards, and it was the first time that I had ever used a word than slave for people who were enslaved in the South. And I resisted a little bit. I thought, oh, why do we need to learn another word? What does that mean? And what I didn't know and didn't ever think about, as a white person, is that slave is a label. Slave is a label that is put on someone and says, this is who this person is. but we know that these were humans, deeply complex humans who did not choose this life. And so to put that word on these individuals, it kind of perpetuates this idealized image of slavery. And that goes along with this image right here, that, they were picking cotton, but it doesn't look like it was so bad. The word that I was asked to use instead was the word enslaved. Yep, thanks, Laura. Exactly, enslaved. And this is a much different thing. Because enslaved says this was put on them. They were put into this situation by someone else, that this was not their fault. This is not who they are. They are being enslaved. And so, as difficult as it is to look at an image like this, I think we have to consider these side by side and these words side by side and really think about the deeper meaning behind the word slave and enslaved. So consider that, as you're thinking about your classroom and what you're already, what words are you using? It took me a while, but now enslaved is the word that I use and on a regular basis. Person first language, Sue. Exactly. Thank you. It's like how it's much better when you're talking about a child with autism rather than a child who is autistic, right? It's person first. Another one that I would like you to think about, this idea of home, okay? And, students might be asked at some point to describe their home. But I think what we have to remember is that not all students have a home. We don't want them to feel like they can't talk about that, or that they don't have a place, or that they don't belong, or they're outsiders because they don't have what we would consider to be, or what, some of the mainstream traditional narrative would consider to be home. So this is a pretty famous image of Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms. This is freedom from fear. And last year, the Smithsonian Magazine invited artists to reimagine what the Four Freedoms would look like today. And I think that this is a really powerful image. So this is of a Latino family in a detention center. And so I want you to think about the words where we live instead of home. Because you are going to have students who are homeless, students who are living with another family member or a friend or their car, or that don't necessarily have this home situation. So shifting that language from tell me about your home to we're going to talk about where we live, or maybe where you want to live, or where someone that you know lives, so that students don't feel by this word. Yeah, and I linked to the Smithsonian article here so that you can see all of the versions of that the artists created to go along with the original Four Freedoms. They're fantastic. All right, and then number 4. Replace or add primary sources. This is my favorite thing to do, and maybe it's because I'm a huge nerd and my favorite thing is to sit down and find primary sources for teachers, but I love to be able to look at a narrative and say, where can I find some new stuff to really broaden the narrative? So really take a deep look at your curriculum and say, and kind of ask, am I using primary sources that focus on a single narrative? Where are the absences in the historical narratives that I teach? Do my primary sources reinforce stereotypes? And are my students' identities represented in my sources? So that goes back to the very first one, is getting to know our students and getting to know who they are, right? And it also goes back to knowing our curriculum and what it is that we teach. And it goes into also shifting our language, that when we're thinking about slavery, let's look at voices of enslaved people, right? So this is an image of a man named Bayard Rustin, and I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Bayard Rustin, but I think he's a great example of this. So Bayard Rustin is very active in the civil rights movement. He was an organizer of the March on Washington, both the attempted one in 1941 and then the one that happened in 1963. He also organized freedom rides. He was very involved. He was also an out gay man. And so yes, so yeah, Laura knows. Thanks, Laura. So he was gay, and at the time, homosexual activity was criminalized in a lot of places in the United States. He actually had gone to jail at one point in time. And so he kind of worked behind the scenes because he wanted to work on the civil rights movement and help Dr. King and Abernathy and all these different folks. But he wanted to make sure that he was doing it in a way that would not become the primary story. But we don't hear about Bayard Rustin quite as much as we hear about Dr. King and we hear about Rosa Parks. But I think that his is a narrative of a person in the 1950s and 1960s who was not only Black, but gay. In a society where both of those two identities were not supported fully by society, and in a lot of ways not supported at all by society. So as you're talking about the civil rights movement, bringing in stories like Bayard Rustin helps expand the narrative. And it also helps if you've got students who identify as LGBTQ in your classrooms, whether they are out with it or not, it helps them really feel like, oh, there's my story too. Okay. So let's look at a couple of examples. So I'm going to harken back to what I said at the very beginning about the 19th Amendment anniversary coming up, and we've seen a lot of really, really great materials coming out about that anniversary and the fact that in a lot of ways, the suffrage movement was incredibly whitewashed in the way that we've taught it, and that it was really the movement of white middle class women. So this is a quote from very famous suffragette, one of the ones that we think of almost immediately when we talk about the suffrage movement. And this is a quote from a speech she gave after she voted illegally in 1872. And it reads, "People, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed the Union, and it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty, while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot." And it's wonderful. There's so much you can pull out of this. There's so many connections you can pull to other documents when she talks about we the people and who does that mean. And it's a great speech altogether. But she was not the only person fighting for women's right to vote. And I think we need to take Susan B. Anthony and say, okay, yes, what you did was incredible and important. But there were other women, in particular women of color, who were fighting against not only their femaleness, but also their race in trying to get the right to vote. And so this is a woman named Anna Julia Cooper. And she wrote a book in 1892 called A Voice from the South. And I just love this quote. "If a woman's own happiness has been ignored or misunderstood in our country's legislating, let her rest her plea not on Indian inferiority, nor on Negro depravity, but on the obligation of legislators to do for her as they would have others do for them, were relations reversed." So what she's saying here, because a lot of white middle class educated women were saying, well, why do you let Black men vote? You know, they are uneducated. They're poor, and we are educated, you know, strong, wealthy women. Or they would look at Indians and say, you know, well, they're inferior. They shouldn't be given the opportunity to vote. They couldn't until 1924 anyway. So Anna Julia Cooper is saying, don't base your arguments on that. Base your arguments on women need the right to vote for the sake of being women. And so as you're talking about these voices from this time period, don't necessarily get rid of Susan B. Anthony. Add Anna Julia Cooper or women like her. And a final example on this one. And this is something that we talk a lot about in Minnesota. We have two historically present and currently present tribes in Minnesota, the Dakota and the Ojibwe, and we're always talking about how do we make sure we're telling these stories in a way that honors this long history and this present. So a lot of people teach about Indian boarding schools. There was certainly Carlisle out in Pennsylvania, and there were boarding schools all over the country where at the turn of the century, the federal government took Indian children, native children, from their homes and put them into boarding schools to quote unquote civilize them and teach them the ways of European Americans. Um, and so we do learn about boarding schools and how traumatic and difficult it was for a lot of these students. Some students did find some hope and pleasure in these places because they had access to meals and things like that. But on the whole, it was traumatic. What I would argue is that we need to make sure that we're not approaching Native American history from a deficit basis and also just from the perspective of Native people reacting to the federal government. You know, because when we talk about Trail of Tears, we talk about Wounded Knee, we're talking a lot of times about how Native Americans acted or reacted in response to something that the federal government did, a policy, a battle, etc. Instead, let's talk about Native agency and how Native people are resilient in the face of all these federal policies and wars, and how they have maintained their culture and made decisions based on their own power and their own ability to uh, to help their children, to help their elders. And so the other image on screen here is a set of spelling cards used in southwestern Minnesota in the 1960s. This is Dakota, the language featured here. And so these were used to teach people Dakota language. And this was done specifically to make sure that the language was continuing. It was Native agency that made this happen. It wasn't necessarily in response to something that anybody else did. It was Dakota people reclaiming the education of their students. So really think about that as you're examining your curriculum, especially if you teach American history, is how are we talking about people of color and Indigenous people and women, historically underrepresented groups? Are we talking about them just based on their relationship, men or the federal government or white people? Or are we bringing out their agency and the ways that they were able to make changes for themselves? So, you know, there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but I think this is a really great place to start. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop here. Are there any questions about any of those 4 strategies before we head into the resources? Oops, went back the wrong way. Okay, well, if you have any, please, tell us again the 4. Absolutely, Sue. So the 4 strategies that we talked about are know your students, examining your curriculum, shifting your language, and replacing or adding primary sources. All right, so let's talk about resources. So how can I learn more? I have, the last couple of years, learned a lot about CRP. I wasn't familiar with it at all until a couple of years ago. And so I've been really trying to dig in and as someone who's not in a classroom on a day-to-day basis, trying to figure out how to learn this to really put it in language that will help teachers. So our whole grant is based on this. And so I would encourage you to visit the site to watch the other videos. The great thing about the videos is that not only were they filmed in actual classrooms with actual teachers and kids, but that the teachers gave us their materials that we then posted with the video. So the lesson plans, the primary sources that they used are all there with each of the videos. So those are up for free for you to access anytime you want. The other 2 websites that I would highly recommend that if you don't already to visit is Teaching Tolerance, which is a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Facing History and Ourselves. They have these huge repositories of articles, activities, lessons, all kinds of stuff. Whenever I need an idea for a PD that I'm doing or something like that, I go visit these 2 sites first and I get ideas. So it's really a fantastic place to start. One thing that I would caution you about with CRP is that, like most of our learning, this is a process and it shifts each year with a new class of students. That when your students change, your curriculum changes, and not entirely. Maybe you swap out a primary source, maybe you consider language that you hadn't considered before. But this is absolutely a process that that you will work your way through, and then always know what you don't know, that sort of thing, that you're always learning about how much there is to learn. Couple of things that just came through on the chat I see is Upstander project, which is a TPS region project, which I think is listed. I think I listed at the end of this presentation. So thank you for that, for the reminder. And then also Lisa talks about how these two organizations have great newsletters. Absolutely true. So many great ideas. Thank you. So then so once I learn about it, how do I begin to shift towards CRP? So I would say first we need to acknowledge that culture is fluid, it's dynamic, and it's always changing. It's not something that is set in stone. As humans, we struggle with change, but that is the nature of culture. Study your students' identities and also, most importantly, their assets. What do they bring to the table? What is it about those students that really sets them apart? What is their cultural competence that they are proud of, or that is a big part of how they identify? Identify the absent narratives and the underrepresented stories in your curriculum, in the narrative that you're teaching. And then think about how you are developing your essential questions and your inquiries. Um, you know, the question that we ask students to ponder, if it's a meaningful question that will cause them to do a lot of the things that you saw the students doing on the video, really smiling and engaging, if it's a meaningful question, they are going to want to do those things, especially if it relates to them in some way. And looking at the inquiry process and coming up with an inquiry is something that you can do with the linked resource, which is the C3 inquiry generator. And the C3 is from the C3 framework from the National Council for the Social Studies. And the three C's are college, career, and civic life. And so you can link to that and get some ideas about inquiries. You don't have to do this alone. Find a mentor, find a colleague or a PLC to collaborate with on this journey. I am always learning new things from the people that I work with, my colleagues here at the Historical Society, the teachers that I encounter, and it makes me feel supported that I don't have to do this alone. That sometimes I feel like, oh, I'm doing all this wrong, or I'm not saying the right things, or I'm not being sensitive to other people's culture. I have people that I can talk to about it. So this is, again, my favorite question because I love to find new sources. But in the age of the internet, we are both cursed and blessed in that there are a zillion things out there. So where do I go? We did actually record an 11-minute webinar. It's pretty short on finding and evaluating sources. Where do I go? How do I use the right search terms so I don't waste time? Because we know that one thing teachers do not have an abundance of is time. So that's a good place to start. But I would also recommend that you peruse curated sets of primary sources. So sets that other people have taken the time to together for you. I mean, if you just need, okay, I need a couple of sources on Abraham Lincoln. Well, I can go to the Library of Congress and look at their primary source set on Lincoln. And that'll save you a bunch of time. So here are 5 places that have some really fantastic primary source sets. Of course, the Library of Congress. The Digital Public Library of America connects to libraries from all over the country, and they have a resource that's not only on history but also on literature. So if you're working with the English teacher in your building, that might be a good place to collaborate. We have primary source sets on our website, and what we tried to do is make sure that we had them for all grade levels, so you will find them that are applicable for K-12. And then 2 other TPS grantees, the Library of Congress, are the State Historical Society of Iowa, Maryland Humanities and Public Television. They both have some great sets. Now I know you can see these. It's like, oh, Minnesota, Iowa, Maryland. That's not where I live. think it's great just to go take a look and say, oh, I could use this particular source, or this gives me an idea for how I can put these types of sources in my class. Have students curate their own sets of sources. And I think this is a really fun activity that you can do with your students, whether you send them off to find their own or you give them a choice of here's 20 sources, pick 5, based on what speaks to them and what they think is important about that particular topic. So let's say you're doing World War I, right? 20 sources set out for the students, and you tell them, okay, you need to choose 5 sources that you think tell the story of World War I that you think is important. And you're going to get, 30 kids in your class, you're going to get 30 different sets based on what speaks to them. But that gives them power and agency to make their own choices. And finally, where else can I find them? I mean, I've looked at the curated sets. I don't, that's good, or I've already seen them. Find your favorite repositories. And everybody has, I think, their favorites. Again, the Library of Congress, National Archives has this really great site called Docs Teach, which is organized by era of American history. But also, don't forget about your state and local historical societies and museums. As someone who works at a state historical society within a museum, I can tell you that we love it when you want to come use our stuff. We love it when teachers find local connections because, again, super relevant for your students to see, oh, that happened down the street from me. And museums are digitizing at a crazy rate because they want people to access and use their materials. So even places like the Met and the British Museum and the Holocaust Museum all have digitized collections. And here's what I do to make sure I don't lose them, because sometimes I'll find something and then can never find again the website that I found it on, Google Doc or a spreadsheet, and keep track of useful sites. That way you have them and you can always get back to them and don't have to do just a 20-minute Google search to find that again. So just a couple of final thoughts as we're wrapping up here, and then please be thinking about any questions or comments that you might have to share at the end. So our students have a lot to teach us. You know, we are not the keepers of all of the knowledge. And I think when we let our students teach us and we co-construct knowledge with them, it creates a collaborative space. It creates a space where students feel empowered and understand that they have a voice and that their lived experience in the world is just as important, no matter how old they are or what their experience is. I think as educators too, we need to practice cultural humility, which is a term I learned a couple of years ago and I really love, because I mean, ultimately, we're not going to ever really be competent in a culture that's not our own. We can foster our own cultural competence and ask students to do that as well, but we need to be humble about culture and just really personally reflect and grow around culture. And so I think that's something that we need to just be keeping in mind all the time as we go through these things. And finally, we can honor our students' lived experiences, and we can offer them sources that challenge them, that encourage their expertise, and empower them to critique the narrative. These are all things that our students are absolutely capable of doing and want to do, and culturally relevant pedagogy can help with that. So with that, the bit.ly that you see on the screen is the bit.ly that will give you access to the Google Slides so that you can access all the sources and the materials. Please feel free to use anything that you'd like. And this is my email address. And I love to hear from teachers, educators from anywhere that you are. I love talking about primary sources. It's my favorite thing. So anytime that you need anything, please feel free to reach out. And then looks like Sue and Barb are saying that they're going to share the link to the recording in a couple of days. So you'll also get this information later. I also linked to all the primary sources here because for me, there's nothing more frustrating than saying, oh, look at that amazing primary source. Where did that come from? And then my hands on it. So here they are. They are linked back to most of them, the Library of Congress, but also a few other places. Here are a few additional resources from the TPS Eastern region, and they do some really excellent work. And these are some projects with CRP themes, including integrating LGBTQ content for elementary, middle, and high school classrooms, teaching the difficult past. We're looking at teaching slavery with primary sources, and also one that was mentioned earlier, Upstander Academy, primary sources uncover overlooked history. And so these will all be really great things for you to peruse as well. And so that is all that I have to share today. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Anything that they want to share?
Jessica, this is Barb on behalf of the Eastern region, myself, Sue, and Josh. Thank you so much. This was such an excellent presentation. Fantastic.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thank you for having me, and I hope that I will have a chance to interact with some of you in the future. But yeah, please do fill out the evaluation so we can know how we did and what we can do to serve you in the future.
Yes, please. Thank you. Cheers, Jessica. It was excellent. And to wrap it up, again, thank you very much for joining us on the line. The TPS Eastern Region delivers about 3 or 4 of these a year. If you would weigh in on what you thought with the link that Sue's typed in the chat room, the bit.ly, so that we can keep on bringing you programs that are right what you need to know when you need to know it. Have a great afternoon, everyone.